On June 15th, 1991, Mount Pinatubo erupted with a force so violent it ripped the top off a mountain and buried entire villages under ash in a matter of hours. Thousands of Aeta families, people who had lived on those slopes for thousands of years, ran for their lives with almost nothing but the clothes on their backs. Among the few things some of them carried out of that disaster were their children, kids with tightly curled black hair that neighboring lowland communities had mocked for generations as foreign, as strange, as proof that somewhere in the family line a Spanish soldier or a wandering sailor had left something behind. For centuries, that explanation was accepted almost without question across the Philippines and much of Southeast Asia. If your hair curled while everyone around you had straight black hair, there had to be an outsider somewhere in your bloodline. Nobody thought to question it. It was just something grandmothers said at dinner tables, a story repeated so many times it hardened into fact. But less than 2 decades after that eruption forced thousands of Aeta out of their ancestral mountains, scientists sequencing their DNA in laboratories on the other side of the world uncovered something that turned that old family folklore completely upside down. What they found did not just complicate the story, it shattered it. And it revealed that the curl in someone's hair might be the single oldest, most authentic marker of ancestry that a human being can carry. Older than any surname, older than any religion, older than the very idea of the Philippines, Malaysia, or Indonesia as nations. If your hair waves or curls and you come from anywhere across Southeast Asia, what you're about to hear will change the way you look in the mirror. For most of the 20th century, the accepted timeline of human history looked fairly tidy. Modern humans emerged in Africa somewhere between 195,000 and 160,000 years ago, based on fossil finds in Ethiopia, and by roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago, groups of them began pushing out of the continent in earnest. One branch is said to have drifted toward the Near East and eventually into Europe. Another moved deeper into Asia. A much later branch crossed into the Americas by way of the far north, over a land bridge that no longer exists. Somewhere along this journey, according to the old assumption, hair texture simply sorted itself by geography. Africans kept the tightly coiled hair associated with the continent. Europeans ended up with a mix of straight, wavy, and curly hair. East Asians, so the thinking went, developed thick, straight, dark hair as the regional default, and that image became so deeply embedded in popular imagination that it eventually was treated as the only authentic look for the entire continent. Under that old framework, an Asian child born with curly hair needed an explanation, and the explanation always pointed outward, never inward. Maybe a Spanish soldier during 3 centuries of colonial rule in the Philippines. Maybe a Portuguese trader passing through the Spice Islands of Indonesia in the 16th century. Maybe a British officer stationed in Malaya. Maybe, in rarer whispered versions of the story, someone of African descent who passed through generations back. Whatever the specific culprit, curly hair was treated as physical evidence that foreign blood had entered the family tree at some point in the past. That theory has now completely fallen apart under the weight of hard genetic evidence. Over roughly the past 20 years, researchers working across the Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, India, and Indonesia have been sequencing the full genomes of groups that most of the modern world barely knows exist. These communities are frequently grouped together under the label Negrito, a name that comes directly from Spanish colonizers and literally translates to little dark ones. It is not a name most of these groups use to describe themselves, and many strongly prefer their own traditional names. In the Philippines alone, there are several genetically and culturally distinct groups, including the Aeta, the Agta, the Ati, the Batak of Palawan, and the Mamanwa of Mindanao. In Malaysia, there are the Semang and the Jahai. In the far south of Thailand survives a tiny population known as the Mani, sometimes called the Sakai in older colonial records, a name many consider offensive today. On the Andaman Islands, scattered between India and Myanmar in the Bay of Bengal, live the Jarawa, the Ong, the Great Andamanese, and the famously isolated North Sentinel Islanders, a group so protected by Indian law that unauthorized contact is a criminal offense. Each of these populations has its own distinct language, its own customs, its own oral history stretching back further than almost any other living culture on Earth. But across nearly all of them, several physical traits repeat again and again: dark brown to nearly black skin, small, slender, energy-efficient body frames suited to hot climates, and tightly curled or spiraled hair, sometimes coiling into dense ringlets, sometimes forming a soft, natural afro, sometimes falling into looser waves depending on the specific population and degree of later mixing with neighboring groups. Consider the Aeta of the Philippines specifically, since their story captures almost everything at stake here. For thousands of years, they lived along the slopes and forests of Mount Pinatubo in central Luzon until the catastrophic 1991 eruption, one of the largest volcanic events of the 20th century, buried their ancestral lands under meters of ash and forced them into permanent displacement. Long before that eruption ever happened, they had already survived Spanish slave raids during the colonial era, waves of American colonial expansion in the early 1900s, and repeated encroachment by lowland farming communities, pushing into territory the Aeta had occupied since long before those farmers ever arrived. Today, they survive in scattered resettlement communities across Zambales, Pampanga, Tarlac, and the Sierra Madre mountain range, still practicing hunting and gathering traditions that stretch back further than the modern Philippine state itself. The Agta live along the eastern coast of Luzon, closely related to the Eta by ancestry but distinct in dialect and cultural practice. The Ati live on Panay Island, an island now internationally famous for its colorful Ati-Atihan festival, a celebration many outsiders assume is simply folkloric costume, without realizing the Atai people themselves were the original inhabitants of that land, present long before any Malay or Spanish influence ever reached its shores. The Mamanwa of Mindanao are considered by many researchers to be among the oldest continuously living populations in the entire Philippine archipelago, and quite possibly across all of insular Southeast Asia. Across the sea on the Malay Peninsula, the Semangs and Jahai continue traditional forest life much as their ancestors did. In southern Thailand, the Mani survive in extraordinarily small numbers, likely only a few hundred individuals remaining in total. And out in the Indian Ocean, the peoples of the Andaman Islands represent what many geneticists now describe as a living window into humanity's very first journey out of Africa. For decades, the working assumption among many researchers was fairly simple on its surface. Dark skin combined with curly hair must mean these groups were descendants of Africans, who somehow wandered thousands of kilometers across Asia and remained isolated in these jungles ever since, essentially unchanged islands of African ancestry, stranded far from home. It made a certain intuitive sense. But when scientists finally sequenced complete genomes from these populations, fully expecting to find strong and relatively recent African ancestry, they found something entirely different from what they predicted. These groups are genetically Asian, deeply ancestrally Asian, with genomes that place them not as recent arrivals wandering in from Africa, but as direct descendants of the very first wave of modern humans who ever left the African continent and traveled east along the coastlines bordering the Indian Ocean. Researchers now call this the Southern Coastal Migration Route, and current genetic and archaeological evidence places it somewhere between 50 and 70,000 years ago. The people who took this route were not the same population that later spread across Europe or northern Asia. They were an earlier separate branch of the human family, moving steadily along the warm shorelines of what is now Yemen, Oman, southern Iran, Pakistan, and India, then continuing onward into what is now Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, and Malaysia, before eventually reaching a massive prehistoric landmass that scientists refer to as Sundaland. During the last ice age, global sea levels sat more than 100 meters lower than they do today because so much of the planet's water was locked up in glaciers. Places we now think of as separate islands, including Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and much of the modern Philippine archipelago, were connected to one another and to the Asian mainland as one enormous continuous stretch of land. A person during that period could theoretically have walked from southern India all the way toward what is now Bali without ever crossing significant open water. It was only later, as the Ice Age ended and rising seas gradually swallowed those low-lying land bridges over thousands of years, that these once connected populations became isolated from one another, splitting into the separated island communities we recognize today. Remarkably, flood stories still appear in oral traditions across this entire region, from Australia to the Philippines, almost as though a kind of folk memory of those rising seas somehow survived, passed down for tens of thousands of years through storytelling alone. Now, here's the part that actually explains why any of this matters for hair texture specifically. Why did these earliest travelers keep tightly curled or wavy hair as they crossed thousands of kilometers of blistering equatorial coastline over tens of thousands of years? The answer, according to researchers who study human adaptation, comes down almost entirely to survival. Curly and tightly coiled hair traps a thin layer of air close to the scalp, which acts as a kind of natural insulating barrier against direct, intense overhead sunlight near the equator. This texture lifts hair away from the skull rather than letting it lie flat against it, which helps keep the head measurably cooler under harsh tropical sun, protecting the scalp and the brain beneath it from overheating during long days of walking, hunting, and gathering. Straight hair, by comparison, tends to lie flush against the scalp and offers far less of that protective buffer. Dark skin served a closely related defensive purpose, shielding the body from intense ultraviolet radiation and reducing the risk of skin damage, while smaller, leaner body frames helped these populations regulate heat and cool down more efficiently in hot, humid equatorial environments. This is not some coincidence unique to Southeast Asia either. Strikingly similar hair and skin adaptations appeared completely independently among equatorial populations in Africa. across Melanesia and throughout parts of New Guinea. Scientists describe this pattern as convergent evolution, where different populations facing the exact same environmental pressure of intense tropical sun arrived at strikingly similar biological solutions completely independently of one another without needing any shared recent ancestry to explain the resemblance. To understand this more fully, it helps to look briefly at the actual genetics involved, because researchers have made real progress mapping this out. Hair texture is shaped by multiple genes working together, and scientists are still refining exactly how they interact. But two genes stand out as central to this particular story. The first is called TCHH, short for trichohyalin, which produces a structural protein found in the inner root sheath of the hair follicle. This protein strongly influences the internal architecture of each individual strand, playing a major role in determining whether hair grows out straight, wavy, or tightly curled. The second is EDR, short for ectodysplasmin A receptor, a gene involved in the development of hair follicles, sweat glands, and even tooth shape during early embryonic growth. A specific variant of this gene, often labeled the 370A variant, is extremely common among East Asian and indigenous American populations today. It is strongly associated with thicker, straighter hair shafts, a noticeably higher density of sweat glands, and even a distinctive shovel-shaped pattern on the back of the front teeth, a trait dental anthropologists have used for decades to trace ancient migration patterns. This particular variant is believed to have arisen through a random mutation somewhere in Northeast Asia roughly 30,000 years ago, and then spread rapidly through East Asian populations before eventually crossing into the Americas by way of the ancient land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska. It is largely responsible for the thick, straight hair so commonly associated with East Asia today. The Negrito populations, however, do not carry that particular East Asian EDAR variant at anywhere near the same frequency as their neighbors. Instead, their genomes carry older gene variants more closely related to those found among South Asian populations, some African populations, and ancient human genomes recovered directly from archaeological remains. In a very real sense, their hair follows an older genetic blueprint, one that predates the newer variant by tens of thousands of years. When their lineage mixes with later arriving East Asian populations, which has happened extensively across the region over the past several thousand years, the result is very often exactly what we see across so much of Southeast Asia today. Hair that is neither perfectly straight nor tightly coiled, but something in between, wavy or loosely curled, alongside skin tones that fall somewhere between the extremes as well. Genetically speaking, these blended traits sit right at the meeting point between two ancient human lineages, the earliest coastal travelers who arrived first, and the later arrivals who eventually came down from the north. There's another layer to this story that makes it even more extraordinary, and it involves a species of ancient human that most people have barely heard of. Several Negrito populations, especially the Aeta and Mamanwa of the Philippines, carry some of the highest levels of Denisovan DNA found anywhere on the planet. Denisovans were an archaic human species, close cousins of the Neanderthals, who lived across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before disappearing as a distinct group sometime in the last 50,000 years. Before they vanished entirely, they interbred with the modern humans passing through their territory, leaving behind fragments of their genome scattered across living populations today. Most people of East Asian descent today carry a small trace of Denisovan ancestry, typically well under 1% of their total genome. But research published over the last several years has found the Aeta carrying somewhere around 5% Denisovan ancestry, with Papuan populations in New Guinea carrying somewhere between 4 and 6%, among the highest documented levels found anywhere on the planet. This means that as the earliest coastal travelers made their extraordinarily long journey east along the Indian Ocean shoreline, they did not simply preserve their curly hair and dark skin unchanged for tens of thousands of years. At some point along that journey, they encountered an entirely different branch of ancient humanity, interbred with them, and their descendants carried that connection forward across tens of thousands of years, all the way to communities alive today in the mountains of Luzon, the forests of Mindanao, and the islands of the Andaman Sea. Some researchers now believe certain Denisovan-derived gene variants may even be linked to immune adaptations against tropical diseases, or to how the human body handles environments with lower oxygen at higher altitudes, though that research is still ongoing and far from fully settled. Now here's where this story becomes deeply personal for tens of millions of people living today. If your family comes from the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, or almost anywhere across Southeast Asia, there is a strong likelihood that your DNA carries some measurable percentage of this ancient coastal ancestry. And if your hair curls or waves rather than lying perfectly straight, that percentage tends to run noticeably higher than the regional average. Large-scale genetic studies mapping Filipino ancestry across the archipelago have found traces of this deep ancestry present in nearly every regional population sampled, ranging from just a few percent in some lowland communities to more than 20% in certain highland and rural groups, with some Cordillera populations in northern Luzon showing even higher levels still. Researchers increasingly describe the Filipino genome as a layered historical record, built from at least 5 separate waves of migration spread across thousands of years. The oldest and deepest layer belongs to the ancestors of the Aeta and related groups. Everyone else built their history on top of that original foundation, including Austronesian-speaking farming communities that arrived from Taiwan roughly 4,000 years ago, bringing rice cultivation and outrigger canoe technology. Traders who came through Borneo and Sulawesi centuries later, merchants who crossed the Indian Ocean from South Asia carrying Hindu and Buddhist cultural influence, and much later Chinese, Spanish, and American arrivals during the colonial and modern periods. The same underlying pattern holds true across the wider region as well. In Malaysia, the Semang and Senoy populations left ancestry that still shows up clearly in the genomes of modern Malay communities, even among people whose families have long identified simply as Malay, without any awareness of this deeper layer. In Indonesia, particularly across its eastern islands, genomes carry deep and measurable traces of Papuan and Negrito-related ancestry, reflecting the region's position at a genetic crossroads between Asia and the Pacific. Southern Thailand, parts of Cambodia, parts of Vietnam, and even certain populations in southern China and southern India carry fainter but still detectable echoes of the same ancient migration. Wherever the southern coastal route once passed, tens of thousands of years ago, it left behind a genetic trail that still shows up today in skin tone and facial structure, and most visibly of all, in hair. So when someone of Filipino, Malaysian, or Indonesian descent is born with curly or wavy hair, that trait is not evidence of some foreign ancestor slipping quietly into the family tree a few generations back, as so many grandmothers insisted for so long. If anything, the science says the exact opposite is true. It is one of the oldest and most original expressions of ancestry found anywhere in the entire region, tracing directly back to the very first humans who ever set foot on Asian soil, long before recorded history, long before agriculture existed anywhere on the planet, long before anyone had a name for the continent we now call Asia. There is also a more difficult, more uncomfortable part of this story that deserves to be told honestly rather than glossed over. Many of these Negrito communities, despite carrying some of the deepest and oldest ancestry anywhere in the region, have faced centuries of hardship precisely because of the physical traits that mark that ancestry. They were repeatedly pushed off their traditional lands by later arriving farming communities with greater numbers and different technology. They were captured and enslaved during periods of Spanish and other colonial rule, their communities raided for forced labor. They were driven further and further into mountains and remote forests as lowland populations expanded outward over the centuries. And often they were looked down upon, even mocked, by neighboring communities who, without realizing it, shared much of that same deep ancestry themselves. In the Philippines today, many Aeta communities continue to live in poverty, frequently overlooked by government programs and largely absent from mainstream national narratives about Filipino identity. In Malaysia, the Semang and Senoy face similar ongoing struggles for land rights and formal recognition. On the Andaman Islands, several groups have dwindled to populations of only a few dozen or a few hundred individuals, with some considered at genuine risk of disappearing entirely within a generation or two. These are, without exaggeration, the communities carrying the deepest and oldest genetic roots of the entire region. And yet many of them remain among the most marginalized people within their own countries, their contribution to the region's ancestry only now being fully recognized by science. There are real signs, though, that attitudes are slowly beginning to shift. Researchers and writers across the Philippines have started actively pushing back against old colonial framings that dismissed Negrito peoples as primitive outsiders, instead calling for recognition of them as the true foundational population of the entire archipelago, the people from whom nearly everyone else's story eventually branches. Similar conversations are emerging in Malaysia around Orang Asli communities, and in Thailand, where the tiny Mani population is increasingly approached with genuine scientific respect rather than treated as a curiosity for outsiders. In India, the Andaman Islands remain protected under some of the strictest indigenous protection laws found anywhere in the world, with outside contact towards certain groups, including the North Sentinelese, strictly forbidden by law precisely to prevent both cultural destruction and the introduction of diseases these isolated populations have no immunity against. So the next time someone suggests that curly hair on an Asian head must come from somewhere else, from some foreign sailor or trader who passed through centuries ago, there is now a very different answer available, one rooted firmly in hard genetic science rather than old assumption. That hair is not a foreign import stitched onto an otherwise pure family line. It is quite possibly the oldest physical trait a person carries in their entire body, older than any surname passed down through generations, older than any religion introduced by later arrivals, older than the language spoken at home today, whatever that language happens to be. It walked along the coastlines of the Indian Ocean before there were nations, before there were written languages anywhere on Earth, before agriculture had even been invented in any corner of the planet. It survived ice ages, survived rising seas that swallowed entire land bridges, survived volcanic eruptions like the one that reshaped Mount Pinatubo, survived the rise and fall of empires, and survived centuries of colonization that tried to erase the very people who carried it. And it is still there today, curling naturally against the same equatorial sun its earliest ancestors once walked beneath, tens of thousands of years ago. On a more practical note, many people with curly or wavy Asian hair grow up without ever learning how to properly care for it, simply because so much of the beauty industry across the region is built around straight hair as the assumed default look. Curly hair is often unfairly labeled as frizzy, unmanageable, or even unprofessional in workplace settings, and many people end up spending years quietly damaging their natural texture with excessive heat styling and harsh chemical straightening treatments, never realizing that their hair simply needs a fundamentally different kind of care altogether. Curly and wavy hair generally needs more consistent moisture, gentler and less frequent washing, the regular use of leave and conditioning products, and careful detangling only while the hair is still damp and conditioned, rather than brushing it dry, which tends to break the strands and create frizz. It tends to genuinely thrive when it is worked with rather than fought against. Interestingly, many older generations across the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia already understood a version of this instinctively, relying on natural ingredients like coconut oil and aloe. Vera passed down as home remedies for generations, long before modern curly hair care routines became fashionable again in recent years. In the end, this is a story about identity built on evidence rather than assumption, about letting DNA speak for itself after centuries of guesswork and quiet shame, and about finally listening to what the body has been saying all along, long before anyone thought to ask it a single question. For generations, curly hair in Asia was treated as something to explain away, something borrowed from elsewhere, a stain on an otherwise straight-haired bloodline. Genetic science has now told a very different story, one that reaches back more than 70,000 years to the very first humans who ever walked out of Africa, followed the coastline eastward across thousands of kilometers of ocean shore, and eventually settled across the islands and forests of what we now call Southeast Asia. Their descendants are still here today, in scattered Negrito communities holding on against extraordinary odds, in mixed ancestry carried quietly inside the DNA of tens of millions of people who have never once thought to question where their features come from, and in the simple everyday curl of someone's hair, catching the same tropical light that has shone down on this part of the world for more than 70,000 years.